Well, hey, thanks for joining us live today. This is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic. And today we're going to be talking about Canada's unused property tax. And what's on my screen right now is Representative Brian Higgins. And he has been a representative fighting Canada's underused housing tax because he believes it's to be completely unfair to Americans, I think it certainly is. Joining me today is Keith Redmond, global advocate for the American Overseas, and John Richardson, lawyer extraordinaire of citizenshipsolutions.ca. We're going to be discussing this, and we would love to get your feedback. So, what's going on is let me just show you what this is all about here. What is the Canadian? And John has a good summary of this. What is the Canadian underused housing tax? John, you want to take it from here? You want to explain to people what it is?
Okay, all around the world, more and more what I would call generally vacant home taxes are being enacted. Basically, the idea is that if a home is not occupied according to certain specifications, usually if it's rented for at least half the year or occupied by the owner, that will qualify. If not, then there's a tax imposed on the owner. Often it's equivalent to 1% of the value or something. But what it is, it's a tax imposed on the owners of properties that are either vacant or not sufficiently used. Okay. Now, Canada has these all over the place. There's British Columbia has one as a province, municipality, city of Toronto has one. I mean, there's just tons of them. And you can be subject to more than one, by the way, incredibly. But Canada has a very, very interesting one. The Canada underused housing tax it's fairly complicated, but at the risk of oversimplification, what matters for our discussion is that it would not apply to the owner of a property who's a Canadian citizen or a permanent resident, meaning under the immigration laws, lives permanently in Canada. It does apply to anybody who's not a Canadian citizen or is not a permanent resident of Canada. Now, that's interesting, right? So I've got to say, it's pure nationality or immigration status based taxation, just like US citizenship taxation, right? Or green card holder taxation, exactly the same thing. And what's going on here is that in upstate New York, it's very close to the Canadian border. A lot of American citizens who are only American citizens own what they see as seasonal properties in Canada. Some of them may be sort of cottages without plumbing, but most of them are actually homes, right? Fully furnished homes. And, places like Niagara Falls, Fort Erie, Saugeen Shores, which is about 4 hours north of where I live, etc. And these people typically will make use of the homes, 4 or 5 months of the year, or, maybe even less, right? And of course, they're caught in this legislation, okay, because they just simply don't meet the occupancy and use requirements. Now, yes, I think I would agree that the purpose of this law was to go after people with money coming out of their ears in Asia, right, who are looking for places to park their money. I mean, Canadian real estate may not be exciting, but, the threat of expropriation is not anywhere on the horizon, sort of thing, right? So there are lots of homes that are vacant. There's also a severe housing shortage in Canada and in other parts of the world. Just go anywhere, including the United States. And this is for many reasons, including the whole Airbnb thing, right? I saw you did a podcast with somebody about Airbnb recently. I didn't listen, but that's a significant contributor to this. Now, what's happened, of course, is that the Americans are justifiably very, very upset about this. I mean, so they're going to get a tax bill from the government of Canada, 1% of, I don't know what it is, 5,000, 10,000, 3,000, I mean, whatever it is. Okay. It's an unwelcome extra expense. And I would agree that most of these people probably are not rolling in money. They're probably middle class Americans. But it's interesting because and of course now enter Congressman Brian Higgins, right? Who's the Democrat congressman in Niagara Falls, Lewiston, whatever area. He's also apparently a member of the Ways and Means Committee, and he is, really, really upset about this. He talks about the unfairness of it. He makes the point that, I mean, these are just people who've had multi-generational cottages. They're not offshore investors. How can they be caught like this? And Brian, I think you're absolutely right. But I would also point out, what about all these Canadian citizens, living in Canada who are subject to U.S. taxes on PFIC, CFCs? Brian says, oh, they might have to sell their cottage. Well, buddy, the transition tax that we've talked about confiscated the pension for a lot of Canadians, right? So, I am sympathetic to you for reasons that I'll get to, but come on, I think the time has come, to level up a little bit here, to be honest about what's going on, in a broader sense, and stop this absolute hypocritical nonsense that somehow it's completely unjust and unfair for Canada to impose a citizenship tax on Americans, but it's perfectly okay. For maybe 1,000 or a couple thousand Americans, I don't know, but I mean the number dwarfs in comparison to the number of Canadians, 1,000,000 plus, who are having their lives upended by U.S. taxation. And it's very interesting because I have two minds of this. On a personal level, I mean, I find this guy about as offensive as any individual carbon life form could come. I mean, his hypocrisy is unbelievable, right? And I don't believe for a minute that he doesn't know about this stuff. But I mean, I think that what he does do, his contribution is useful in that it illuminates the issue of citizenship taxation. It also illuminates, why Canada's tax might actually be in violation of a tax treaty or, perhaps the U.S., Mexico, whatever free trade agreement. And so this gave me the opportunity, we'll talk about this today, to look at a specific provision of the treaty and think about whether Canada's tax might in fact violate the treaty, right? So, that's kind of where we are. I mean, the Americans are just incensed. I mean, they just cannot believe this injustice, which really, I find extremely irritating. Okay.
Well, yeah, and this is what I would say about it. I'm going to ask Keith for his input on this because, well, here it is. And by the way, I'm certainly against this tax. Certainly think it's unfair, and certainly are on the side of the people impacted by this. But here's the thing: is that, boy, I would imagine there's going to be a good at least maybe 20,000 Americans impacted by this, maybe something like that. The amount of Americans impacted by this, Keith, would you say? I'm going to say just like 10,000 to 20,000. Now, Keith, how many Americans live overseas, and how many? What's the number there?
Well, it depends on what you use. I mean, the current U.S. State Department figure they are suggesting is 9 million. However, the federal voter overseas program states that there's about 6 million who are eligible to vote. So let's use the lowball number. Let's say 6 to 7 million, for example.
Yeah. Now, Keith, on those 6 million, let's go with the lower figure. How many of those 6 million are impacted by citizenship-based taxation?
Well, how do I answer this? Technically, anyone who is of working age is impacted by citizenship-based taxation. Now, you're not intimately impacted by it unless you're in the U.S. tax system. So, but all of the 6 million are impacted by it.
Now, would you say they're negative? Now, would you say how many are negatively impacted by it, where they have, how many of them have more expensive tax filing requirements?
Well, I would say, let me just back up for a second. So amongst those 6 million is what they deem Americans overseas. So that includes short-term American expats as well as American immigrants with an E, meaning Americans who have emigrated from the United States to other countries. So I would say that those who are living permanently outside the United States, the vast majority of them are negatively impacted by citizenship-based taxation.
And
yeah.
And Keith, we've been trying for years to get some attention to this incredible problem, right?
Correct.
And recently we had a Representative Don Beyer propose a bill, which we think is a step in the right direction.
Right. He's recognizing that there is a problem with the taxation situation for Americans overseas. Yeah.
So I guess this is my question for you. How do you feel? On one hand, that Brian Higgins, and he's on the House Ways and Means. He's fired up about this. He actually might be right. His argument actually might be right. But how do you feel about Brian Higgins giving all of his attention to this issue, meanwhile ignoring the millions of Americans who are forced to, and people who are forced to renounce their citizenship in order to live? How do you feel about that? Doesn't one seem like it should deserve a little bit more attention than it gets?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, to answer you, I mean, a complete and utter frustration is, I would have to say, my feeling, because, you know, ever since the advent of FATCA, it really has put on the front burner the evils, if you will, of citizenship-based taxation. Yeah. And Lord knows over the years there have been plenty of submissions, plenty of surveys, plenty of emails, plenty of phone calls, you know, collectively, individually. Certain American overseas organizations have expressed the situation. And it's just like, well, what more can one do? It's almost like there's this mental incapacity of understanding. And if that's the case, what is the incapacity? Why is it
they don't want to,
that
right?
it cannot be understood? Is it cloaked in the flag? Is it, you know, it just makes you wonder why it's so difficult to even have an understanding. Granted, we have Don Beyer, and good for him, but that's one person.
That's one.
One person. I mean, even Carolyn Maloney, who was head of the Americans Abroad Caucus, aside from doing nothing, she didn't even have an understanding of it.
Yeah.
And she was head of the Americans Abroad Caucus for many years.
Yeah. So I just want to read this. I just want to read a quote from Representative Higgins' letter. The unintended consequences of the underused housing tax has harmed the economy and culture of border communities. Americans who own modest generational properties near the border are unfairly caught in its nest, jeopardizing the health of these longstanding binational neighborhoods. My office continues to receive outreach daily expressing concerns about underusing housing tax and the financial burden it will take place on hardworking Americans who cherish their cottages in Canada. Now, I would say I agree with this. I mean, the thing is, like, well, this is a great letter, but what is crippling, I think, is what's crippling is look, we don't want anybody, you know, properties destroyed by unfair taxation, but we have such a larger issue going on that's impacting so many people in here. And I would say this: I don't think there's anyone who needs to divorce to solve the problem or renounce their U.S. citizenship. That's so one seems like it would be a higher priority than another. Both are totally unfair. And I certainly want this to go away. So I think that's where we're at. So my hypocrisy meter isn't breaking because Brian Higgins is advocating for this underused housing tax to go away and not impact America's way, but rather it's I would say it's the effort that the attention is a complete hypocrisy because we're ignoring the bigger issue.
And because it's ignoring the continued and persistent terrorization financially of a large population,
much larger,
of Americans, U.S. persons overseas.
Man, he just wants to talk about this. All right. Well, thank you, Keith. Thanks for that. So let's go back to John in your article. So we've gone over what this is. And do you want to go over the argument now, John, in his testimony?
Yeah, just give me 1 second here, okay?
You bet, you
Mm.
bet. And I do have a link to this if you want to. I'm not able to play the interview here, but I did give the link to if you want to listen to Representative Higgins interview here. I did give the screen. You could just play that yourself. I'm not able to play it through the podcast right now. This is, and you know what, John, you did bring something up though. We are seeing these taxes that are really going after property owners. Yeah, last week I did do a podcast with Tom Groth on local law 18, which is a law in New York City that is kind of forcing people to be roommates with anybody they want to do an Airbnb with. We've gone over solutions. I've waited to work around that, but we're really seeing that I think the governments see, hey, there's Airbnbs and they're making all this money. We don't like that. Let's use our tax code to stop it, or we'll create other laws that create tax consequences. And that's actually the problem with the local law 18 is that a lot of people, their Airbnb is an ordinary business expense. But when what's happening is they're forced into a long-term rental, which doesn't have the same tax benefits. And so it's pretty awful. So, John, what do you got here? What do you got for us? I'll go back to your
Okay,
article.
why don't you refresh the post? Okay, first
All
of
right. Ooh,
all,
refresh. All right. Even
refresh on that.
you were editing on the fly. Wow, we are multi-talented here, aren't we? Okay.
Okay. For pause there for a minute.
Yep.
First of all, the reason this guy I find him so dislikable, okay, is look at this claim. This is a quote out of his interview. Now reflect on this for a minute. Good Americans should not have a Canadian tax imposed on them. Let's pause again and listen to this.
Yeah.
Good Americans should not have a Canadian tax. I mean, is this guy he's completely out of his mind. Okay. And he's on the Ways and Means Committee, by the way.
And they write the laws. They write the tax law. Ways and Means is a
I'm
nice.
sorry. What is a good American? What is the definition of a good American?
Probably a Democrat.
A good American, I think, is somebody who what I read that as is a good American according to his eyes, and a good American according to his eyes, somebody who we get to tax, we get to punish. That's a good American. A bad American is somebody who's getting punished by someone else. And that actually what seems to be, if you've been a fan of this podcast, we've sort of have a different look at the founding of this country. We don't necessarily believe it was to fight for tax liberty, tax justice, but rather the founders were intensely jealous of the British right to tax. And that's what it was really about. And the only evidence for that is kind of the entire history of the American nation, and really the first tax ever imposed in this country. It was a tax that was far worse than anything the British ever imagined. Was going to single out a particular group to pay for it, and that was the excise tax of 1791, which led to something you folks might remember as the Whiskey Rebellion. This tax was just so awful, so hated. Not only was it a high tax, but it also parked federal revenuers in the homes and offices and places of business and communities of people in rural America who the impact, the tax hit the worst because whiskey was essentially a currency out there. And so basically whiskey, this is how cheap they got whiskey down to about $6 a gallon to make, but the tax made it about $9, which really put a dent in everybody and was not impacted by the Easterners. Easterners didn't if you drink a little bit, you pay a little bit, but it wasn't a big deal. So from the foundation of this country, we have seen punitive taxation on particular parts of Americans. And right now, we know that expats are getting hammered. And if you have investments overseas, the rules are incredibly different. Even in international real estate, if you own real estate, you're not able to take the same depreciation rules. Your tax, it's worldwide income, but we have totally different depreciation rules that aren't as helpful as American. So that's kind of what we have. And that's what I see here. This is just a continuation of what's been going on since 1791, that I see. Brian Higgins what's Canada doing? What do they think they're doing with punitive taxes on Americans? That's our turf here. That's where I'm at, John. That's kind of.
Well, I think, you make an interesting point because, one of the things that I have thought about from time to time is rather than, create all these tax laws that hurt Americans abroad, why not simply add to FATCA, some kind of a punishment for any country that imposes taxes on any American citizen at any time?
And you know
Why
what?
not just use the strength of the dollar as the reserve currency to absolutely prohibit any country at any time under any circumstances from taxing an American, so that only United States can tax Americans. So Americans travel the world, hold up their passport. It's a tax deflector. It's a tax deflector.
Right. You get hammered by only one country is allowed to own you, not other
I mean, it's
countries.
really interesting
That's what
here
it is.
that Congressman Higgins seems to ignore the fact. He says, well, these people live in Canada 4 months of the year, and these are multi-generational homes. Well, so they live in Canada. They're using Canadian servers. They don't pay taxes. I mean, they're basically freeloaders.
Right.
I mean, isn't this an argument for not only for them to have to pay this, but more? But I don't know. Anyway,
let's get in. Yeah. So let's get it. So let's get into. Okay. So let's. I mean, and so here we go. So we're going to be talking about. Well, is Representative Higgins, who we find completely obnoxious, but is his argument correct?
Okay. So he's got 2 potential violations, and this was in his submission to the Canadian Parliamentary Committee in June. This is an excerpt from it. He lists 2. One, the United States, Mexico, Canada Free Trade Agreement that we're not going to talk about today. We can do that in a separate podcast. But he also talks about, although let's just pause for a minute and look at what this says. So the bedrock principle of USMCA or CUSMA is the requirement for all parties to not discriminate against each other or provide preferential treatment solely to domestic companies or citizens, applying with respect to matters of internal taxation. Then he says, well, the underused housing tax violates that. Well, let's pause for a minute. What about the PFIC rules? For example, right? So the U.S. imposes these rules on Canadians, so a certain subclass of Canadians is punished. I mean, I agree that this ought to be analyzed in the context of the free trade agreement, but I also think that the whole ball of wax needs to be unrolled. Okay.
All right. So John, is your argument
PFIC rules, all this stuff?
So passive foreign investment companies, usually mutual funds, are taxed terribly. Your foreign ones, even if you're a Canadian dual US, if you're a US person in Canada with PFICs in Canada, this is the question. Would you say that this is what I have? Would you say that there's a potential violation of the same treaty with the PFIC rules?
Well, it's clearly punishing a certain class of citizens who buy a Canadian mutual fund. Okay. Now, so in other words, that hurts the business of the mutual fund, right? A certain class of people can't invest them, and I don't know if it violates the agreement or not, but it does seem to me that if we're going to start talking about whether Canada's underused housing tax violates the spirit of the free trade agreement, then I think we've got to look at a lot of U.S. taxes, okay, that certainly burden Canadian businesses and Canadians, right? I think citizenship taxation in general does that. I mean, maybe this would be a context to discuss that, but certainly specific aspects of it. The PFIC rules come to mind, absolutely. I think the CFC rules are a burden. So I think there's a whole pile of things that I do agree could and should usefully be discussed in the context of that agreement. But we're going to have to leave.
Yeah, but Representative Higgins is not interested in fighting for those, though. But this one, that's all right. I mean, he said
he doesn't care about the principle, and he certainly doesn't care about U.S. citizenship taxation affecting residents of other countries. He just wants, he's like a mafia don, right? So he's got these people who live under his protection. Think Don Higgins, okay?
Don Higgins.
Don't mess with Don Higgins people. That's what he's saying.
That's kind of what that's what the good American is, Keith, is one of his people who
exactly.
That's what I would say.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
But let's move down to the treaty issue.
Okay.
Now go slowly on this. Now, what he says is, this is interesting for one reason. Now this is an excerpt from his submission.
Okay. What I'm looking at here.
I want you to notice here. He's talking about Article 25, non-discrimination, he's got the wrong article. Okay, this isn't determinative of anything, but it was amended by a 2007 protocol.
Okay.
But let's just look at what he's incorrectly looking at for a minute. Now, his claim is that this particular article, what he's looking at, right, the 1984 version, is violated by Canada's underused housing tax. Now, it says citizens of a contracting state who are residents of the other contracting state shall not be subject in that other state to any taxation requirement. Now, the first point I want to make is that that particular thing doesn't help him. Because if we translate that to what he's trying to do, citizens of the United States who are residents of Canada, these aren't residents of Canada, right? Okay. So now, fortunately for Congressman Higgins, this was amended, okay, in 2007 to operate more broadly, and we'll get to that. But my point is simply, it's kind of a parenthetical one here, that he's not even looking at the right, he's not looking at the right treaty. But okay,
So he's looking at he's not looking at the right treaty, but he inadvertently happens to be right because it was fixed to.
Maybe he's right. Let's
Okay,
continue on.
he still could be right. Okay.
Okay. Now, we think about non-discrimination, a basic analysis. I added this morning because, again, this is something I've not thought about to any degree. And when I do these things, I sort of write them and then I sleep. And when I wake up, I have additional thoughts frequently. Okay. And this was a morning thought. Okay. A 5 a.m. thought. But, a basic analysis here. One thing that's interesting is that this particular treaty clause is apparently a fairly standard treaty clause right around the world. It's in the OECD Model Tax Treaty. I also checked, and I think this is very significant, that Canada has a similar clause in treaties with a lot of other countries. Okay. So this is just not, this is not just a US, Canada-based thing. Now, here's my conclusion on this, okay? That generally speaking, although these things can be read to somehow create a presumption against nationality-based taxation, not really. Okay, I mean, it has to be extremely egregious and arbitrary, to meet that standard. Anytime there's a distinction between tax residents and non-residents, I think you're going to lose under this particular clause.
Well, I mean, to say that you're going to lose and that you won't be able.
You're not going to be able to make out a non-discrimination case. Okay,
right? When you're based on resident versus non-resident.
Yeah, if you're comparing a tax resident to somebody who's not, but if you're comparing two people who are not tax residents, right, of the country, then I think you may.
Oh, okay.
Right?
So that's really the difference. So that's really the thing, because I'm right, and there's plenty of taxes that are different between residents and non-residents, and
that's right.
The Supreme Court has upheld those again. So but when you're treating two non-residents differently based on their nationality,
that seems to me to cause problems. Now, if we go back to underused housing tax, right? This is why I think they may have a problem. And again, I would encourage. I'd be very interested in there being a challenge to this. Okay, I think this is wrong. I mean, Higgins is extremely obnoxious in his hypocrisy. Okay, but I also happen to think that this Canadian tax, may very well, all right, violate the treaty non-discrimination clause, because let's look at it this way, right? So, we're looking at this from the Canada-US perspective, as we always do, but let's say, look at the UK. Let's say we have a British citizen and a Canadian citizen, living outside Canada. The British citizen is subject to the tax, Canadians. In other words, this thing just, it replicates the problem, like right around the world. Everywhere Canada has a tax treaty, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So, this is an interesting problem. And here's my test, right? If you just scroll up a little bit, when considering two non-residents of Canada.
Where are we here? A little
down, sorry.
Down.
We lost it.
Oh, okay, right there. Here we go.
Oh, yeah. When considering two non-residents of Canada, a Canadian citizen will not be subject to the tax, but a U.S. citizen will be subject to the tax, right?
Okay.
This is where I think they've got a problem.
Yeah.
And I think a very significant problem. Because what's interesting about this underused housing tax, and this is in contrast to the British Columbia one, The British Columbian one is very bad, but it's based on tax residency, residence versus non-residence from a tax perspective. Canada has a residency-based taxation system. So this particular tax has nothing to do with residence or non-residence. It has everything to do with citizenship or permanent residence.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So when I look at this, if I were Congressman Higgins, I would get my lawyers to focus on that and just say, look, this guy, one of my people here, is a U.S. citizen, and he has to pay that. His neighbor has lived in the same town for the last 50 years. A Canadian who doesn't have to pay this tax, right? This is the basis for the claim under the treaty.
Yeah. All right. Well, I mean, so it's sort of, I could see, here's what I'm trying to reconcile, right? Is that we have a citizenship-based taxation imposed on Americans around the world that it is discriminatory, it's punitive, it's awful in every which way. And to try to find, here's you try to find the legal arguments to show how discriminatory it is has been difficult. And now we have Canada, which doesn't have citizenship-based taxation, but here they are in an obvious, what looks like an obvious, obviously discrimination. Whereas, and it seems like they're trying to create a pseudo citizenship-based taxation. And, my thought as you're discussing is, this is why why governments love to tax real estate is because that real estate can't go anywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
Your real estate can't escape. You might, but your real estate's going to be here. And that's why they love throwing these things at it, because what can you really do about it? You don't have a choice. And if you don't, and if you don't pay it, hey, we'll just take the property. So it's really a way to imprison people by going, attacking property is really a great way to do it. And that just seems like Canada went a little too far here, because, well, here's my question is, so if they just said, yeah, no, we're just going to apply this equally to, if we're going to apply it equally, whether somebody is a Canadian resident or not, that would be fine.
Absolutely, and that would be fine. And that would be, for example, the Toronto, vacant home tax. I mean, I live in Toronto, and the way it works is really quite simple. Every property, you just register as the owner of a property. You just get an email saying, "Buddy, fill this out," and if you don't fill it out, we'll presume the property's vacant. And how was it used? That's it. There's no question of, are you a Canadian citizen, or it's very, very simple, right? Here's the property.
Yeah.
How was it used? That's it. Now, regardless of how you feel about that particular tax, clearly that tax is not going to violate anything in a tax treaty. And I think a reasonable response, on Canada's part might be to, if they really want to continue this, if they really do, which I don't know how wise that is, but if they really want to continue it, maybe they just, make citizenship and immigration status irrelevant, the same way the municipalities do. But they haven't done that.
Yeah.
And the reason is the motivation for this tax is, all these politicians, they deflect their problems by saying, "Oh my God, it's caused by the foreigner," right? The foreigner is always hated. So we have all the, these wealthy Asians, or maybe not so wealthy Asians, who want to keep what they have, will invest their money in Canadian real estate. Okay. That's what it's aimed at, right? I mean, I certainly agree with Congressman Higgins on that particular point. It's not aimed at, the Americans with these multi-generational homes. But hey, the CFC rules were never aimed at Canadians with small businesses.
Yeah.
Fix either, buddy. Okay. So just stop your yapping. Yeah. Okay. I mean, making arguments, for a complete analysis of all forms of citizenship taxation between Canada and the United States. His problem is, and the reason he's so offensive, is that what he wants to do is bracket off, the U.S., what are really tax atrocities around the world. They're committing atrocities around the world.
Absolutely.
Confiscating people. He wants to bracket that off as if it doesn't exist and say, "Oh, Canada's doing a bad thing."
Yeah, yeah. And that's
no good American should be subject to a Canadian tax, right?
Well, in what you said there, and I want to get Keith's feedback on this, is sort of this fear of anything foreign, and and all the
Yeah.
problems. Keith,
Yeah.
all the problems in this world. Because when I read statements from Ron Wyden, when I'm reading statements of people, hey, look, and then also the recent uh, cutting of funds to the IRS, on all this, it's what I learned is the problem. The problem is fat cats evading taxes overseas. And
Yeah.
that's the problem. And so we have a complete demonization by our politicians in our and the actual tax code. So it's key that's sort of the feeling that we have a tax code that fears and hates us. Is that kind of what you think about that?
Yeah, I do. And certainly specifically when it comes to Americans living outside the United States, that, I wrote an article for CNBC a number of years ago. There's this unusual cultural phenomena in the United States that if you are an American living outside in a foreign country, that you must be committing some type of nefarious activity. Because why would you not live in the greatest country of all of mankind?
I
And so,
know.
as a result of living outside, you have those pesky foreign bank accounts. So you
Yeah.
must be hiding money in France,
Yeah.
or where the taxation
Well,
is
right.
almost double or treble than what
Yeah.
it is in the
That's
United
that's what you're
States.
right. That's what you're doing, right? Well, you're not.
And and,
Yeah.
and what I find ironic and the hypocrisy of it is that, guess the tax cheats outside the United States that hide money from their country's tax authorities. Guess where they hide their money? In the good old
The
U.S. of
United
A.
States, yeah, no, there's awesome, and that's what this is what also is sort of what I find kind of obnoxious is that if you're truly wealthy, you
There's
could avoid
ways,
you could avoid, and there's I mean you could avoid the payment of taxes forever, and no matter where you live, you could avoid the payment of federal
right,
taxes, state taxes if you're able to set up the right
right,
structures, and certainly they're there.
right,
They are absolutely
right,
there. I know people do them. But here's the problem: you need to be wealthy.
right. And
You
the
need to be
evidence,
wealthy. If you
and
don't
the
have, and
evidence.
then yeah, if
Yeah,
you're
go ahead.
wealthy, you
Sorry.
could avoid taxes. If you're not wealthy, you have to earn. If you have to make an income, then your
Right,
income is hammered. And so that's where it's totally off. It's totally off the rails. Where they're saying these fat cats are avoiding taxes. They're
right,
not paying taxes to begin with.
right. And the evidence
And if
is
they're not,
there.
then they have just terrible advisors. And let me just say, if you are a fat cat paying taxes, let me just throw out my email right there.
But here's the thing,
We'll make
Anthony.
sure that you don't.
But here's the thing. So what if you're a fat cat? I can understand. You're living in the United States and you're hiding money to avoid paying taxes in the United States. I get that, okay? But just because you're a fat cat living in France or Germany or whatever, the U.S. doesn't have any, the U.S. doesn't have a right to that money.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? So what if they're a fat cat? They have
So
nothing to
what,
do with the
right?
United
Well,
States.
it gets down to the jealousy. Hey, look, we are, a good American is an American who is a property of the United States of America. That's what a good American is, and so that's what they all want us to be, is those good Americans. All right, John, back to you here. So
You know what they
what?
could do? Just a
Yeah,
thought on this. What
yeah.
Canada probably should do is just amend the tax so that it applies only to people who are not tax residents of Canada. Okay, that would do it, I think, because then that would avoid the situation of the Canadian citizen living beside the U.S. citizen, the U.S. citizen being subject to the tax, but the Canadian not. If you turn it into tax residency, I think you probably avoid the problem. So maybe that's what they should do. I think it's such a ridiculous tax. I think they should get rid of it. And and I do. By the way, I do. While disliking the hypocrisy, I agree. With the individual Americans affected by this, and I agree that this is wrong. I just disapprove of Higgins' tactics.
Well, maybe people who are impacted by this, maybe it's time just to not think about yourself, but say, well, yeah, what else is going on? This is
What you
pretty
have in
crazy.
front of you here, Treasury's explanation. Now, this is quite interesting because what they do is they explain why it's okay to tax a non-resident Canadian differently from a non-resident American. That does not violate. Now, this is how they explain. Now, I explained why Canada's tax would, looking at two non-residents. What Treasury is saying is this, that because U.S. citizens are subject to citizenship taxation, there's no such thing as a U.S. citizen who is a non-resident. Therefore, a comparison between a Canadian non-resident and a U.S. citizen who's a non-resident who can never really be a non-resident would not violate the treaty. Now, this is amazing stuff, right? Now, I'll develop this a little more later, but what this really is a claim by the United States. Are you ready for this? Only the United States can have citizenship taxation. You see that?
Yeah. Oh my God.
I mean, it's incredible stuff.
Wow. That
Here,
is
let me read
right.
this bolded thing. It's so
please.
astounding, right? Now they're talking about, this non-discrimination clause, right? So this language means the United States is not obliged to apply the same taxing regime to a national of Canada who's not resident of the United States as it applies to a U.S. national who is not resident in the United States. U.S. citizens who are not residents but who are nevertheless subject to tax on their worldwide income are not in the same circumstances, right? I mean, this is, you just can't make this up, right? It's as though the U.S. cannot violate the non-discrimination clause, which complains about taxation based on citizenship by and only because for the reason that the U.S. has citizenship taxation. I mean, this makes sense. Just over the top, right? It is over the top.
Well, this is what makes sense now. Why would Representative Higgins actually care? Maybe he cares about his constituents. But maybe this argument's just sort of more of a Trojan horse to establish firmly we are the only ones who can own our citizens' Canada.
Exactly.
You.
I mean, it's amazing stuff. So in other words, I mean, think about it for a minute, right?
Right.
So we have the Canada-U.S. tax treaty, and what Treasury's explanation strongly suggests is that the non-discrimination clause is a clause that can only apply to Canada. You see that?
Oh my, that is brilliant. Oh, this explains it.
I mean, that's why I included that excerpt. I mean, I think I'm right on that. Okay. This is amazing stuff, right? So, we talked last podcast about how, we were talking about aspects of the tax treaty, and we were looking for, in conjunction with this, this net investment income tax issue, right? A part of a treaty that refers specifically to a U.S. citizen resident in France or whatever. Now, that's a part of the treaty that recognizes and therefore reinforces citizenship taxation, but it's the Treasury explanation here, right? Not so much the terms of the treaty, which reflect their view that really, because the United States has citizenship taxation, the United States can never discriminate based on citizenship. Only other countries can discriminate against Americans.
Okay, this makes sense now.
I mean, this is amazing stuff.
So, wow. Oh my.
And just think
Treasury's just doing what, they're doing what we're protecting our turf. We're protecting our turf. And, they're using the guys and, again, and here's the thing. What does it cost Treasury to challenge this? What does it cost Representative Higgins to challenge this? Well, he's actually looked like a good guy, but while looking like a good guy, he's really jamming it down, just so you guys know. And if anyone other country has any ideas that you're going to do this, understand we can only do this and you can't. And
I wouldn't expand it too far. Okay. I think that may be what he thinks, but as per the contents of the treaty, it looks to me as though Treasury's interpretation based on that is the U.S., because it has citizenship taxation, really could never discriminate in a meaningful way based on citizenship. Okay. Only Canada can do that. And look what they're doing. They have citizenship taxation in this instance, but because they have a residency-based taxation system, therefore they're capable of discriminating based on citizenship. But because the U.S. is a citizenship-based taxation, the U.S. could never discriminate based on citizenship because it's just who we are.
Oh my. Keith, what's your reaction to this? What? This is. I'm trying to figure the right analogy for this. This is just.
Yeah.
Ooh, I mean, it's just naked. It's just sort of naked imperialism. It's naked tax imperialism. I don't know, Keith. What is your reaction here?
Well, I'm not shocked.
Yeah, right. This
I'm
is
not shocked.
right. I mean, that's the thing. This is the theme. We see the theme. What is this really about? And what citizenship-based taxation is about control. It's about control, and it's about protecting the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency. We never asked for citizenship-based taxation. It was something we never voted for, but it was imposed on us by through odd ways, which we've discussed in the past. And here it is, just the American imposing its exceptional tax system as it is. So, John, do you want to cover yeah.
Let's read this is a standard treaty. So, I mean, this is actually, what we should do? Actually, before we do that, go down to the appendix where I've got the U.S. model tax treaty provision. Okay, I want people to see
the U.S. model. Okay,
keep going down. Be more like C.
There we go.
Stop there.
Yep.
So this is the U.S. model tax treaty. Now, this is sort of, the way, the tax treaty world according to Treasury. So let's look at this. Nationals of a contracting state shall not be subjected in the other contracting state to any taxation or any requirement connected to this more burdensome than taxation and connected requirements to which nationals of that other state. Now, this language, in the same circumstances, flows through all of these treaties worldwide, okay, including the OECD model tax treaty. In the same, in particular, now it says in particular with respect to residence. Now, my reading on this, which for full disclosure is not tons, okay, I've just been working on this since yesterday. And I hadn't really, taken a look at this too much before, but the way I understand the way people interpreting this is that it's really the same circumstances means whether they're both residents or non-residents. Okay. I mean, that's the main thing. And they say in particular with respect to residents. Now, this provision shall also apply to persons who are not residents or one or both. Okay. However, now listen to this. Forever for the person, United States nationals who are subject to tax on a worldwide basis are not in the same circumstances as nationals of Canada who are not residents of the United States. You see that?
Right,
I mean, the model tax treaty actually incorporates Treasury's technical interpretation that we were talking about a minute ago. In other words, no U.S. citizen can ever use this non-discrimination clause. Never.
Yeah.
Why? They make it very, very clear because, are subject to wherever, just based on citizenship. That's it. I mean, this is extraordinary stuff. So I think the way the world needs to understand this, okay, is that this is a treaty provision that really applies only to the other country, okay, because the United States has said, now, what Canada could do, to get around this, in addition to, changing the underused housing tax to based on tax residence would obviously be just, enact citizenship taxation. Oh, we need tax treaty equality with the United States. Why don't we have citizenship taxation too?
Oh my. And I think for that, America would invade Canada if they did that. I actually think they would.
Well, I think the time has come for people to understand that U.S. tax policies and treaties are fundamentally an act of war. Because don't forget, we haven't even talked today about the saving clause, where these countries actually agree that the United States can come in and cherry pick their residents by calling them citizens and, and tax them.
Wow. All right. Wow. This is incredibly illuminating. Incredibly illuminating. The conspiracy is out in the open. You just have to.
I don't know that it's a conspiracy. I think it's just nobody. A conspiracy means people agree. People actually agreeing to something. This is just unilateral abuse on the part of the U.S. Treasury and the government generally. But we look at this, and I don't know. Why don't we close with what the treaty actually says at the moment between Canada and the United States?
Okay. Where are we here?
Well,
Down below.
yeah, well, 1985. Yeah, keep going down. I've got
We're-
the progression of the treaties, right?
Okay.
Keep going down, including the Treasury. Now stop. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, 2000. Okay, here we are. Yeah, just up a touch. 2007 protocol to Canada-U.S. tax. Oh, move up. We don't want the protocol. We want the text. Up a little more. A little more.
Oh, okay. This.
Stop.
Yep.
Here's
Okay.
what it actually says today. Okay, Congressman Higgins didn't realize that it's been updated, but here's what it actually says today. Now let's go through this between Canada and the U.S. Nationals of a contracting state shall not be subjected in the other contracting state to any taxation or any requirement connected therewith that is more burdensome than the taxation and connected requirements which nationals of the other state in the same circumstances, particularly with respect to taxation, may be subjected. Now, the words in the same circumstances generally mean resident versus non-resident. Okay, in other words, you can't treat two residents the same differently, or you can't treat two non-residents differently, but you can always treat residents differently from non-residents. Okay, now that's what it says, right? Okay, but again, the way the Canadian tax is drafted, and this is interesting, is that it's based purely on citizenship. Okay, it's not an income tax, it's based on a capital tax, which is part of the treaty. But, okay, again, what we have is, just imagine in Buffalo, New York, we have a US citizen and his Canadian citizen neighbor. They own adjoining cottages in Fort Erie, Ontario. Canadian citizen doesn't have to pay the tax just because of citizenship. The US citizen does. I mean, I think that is extremely egregious. I think it's wrong. Obviously, I think it's wrong. And I think that the way to do this, I think Congressman Higgins should stop yapping, okay, and making outrageous, claims like good Americans should not be subject to Canadian tax. What kind of bullshit is that? All right, I think what he ought to do is formally use the tax treaty provisions to raise this to the level of the competent authorities, explain his position, and I believe that this tax does violate the U.S.-Canada tax treaty because of that clause, and Canada's tax treaty with almost every other country in the world, which has a similar clause.
All right. Wow. Well, there we go. So, well, I think we got a fantastic analysis on this. Really, John, I really appreciate digging deep into this, and pointing out. So Congressman Higgins is right legally.
Congressman Higgins is a jerk. Let's start with that.
Okay, so we'll start with that. Okay, but he happens to be correct that Canada's underused housing tax is discriminatory, and according to the treaty, it violates the treaty.
I think that a reasonable case can be made. Okay, but I will say this. All right, that my impression is that it is very difficult to make these claims under the non-discrimination clause, generally very difficult. The OECD commentary on this goes upside down, sideways, and says all kinds of distinctions are normal in the world of taxation. Applying it's got to be really egregious. And not only does it have to be egregious, but there's a fairly low standard of review. In other words, this comes with a presumption of being okay. You've got to clear those hurdles. But this particular thing is so bad. Okay, so blatantly discriminatory based on citizenship, right? In its treatment of non-residents of Canada, that I think he's got a shot at it, and I would like to see him do this. Partly because by making this challenge, it begins the process of illuminating the whole issue of citizenship taxation generally. And if he wants to make a free trade argument, I'm in favor of that as well, because that provides an opportunity, I think, to bring in the whole issue of PFIC taxation and things that I'm not sure they violate the free trade agreement, but it does seem to me that if Canada's underused housing tax can violate the free trade agreement, then why wouldn't a clear trade impediment. Okay, like the PFIC regime. Why wouldn't that, right?
A good point. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. All right. Yeah. So we're gonna. Oh, we got to. Let's see if we got to come here before we conclude. Here we got. So let's see here. Melvin says. Melvin says reading the non-discrimination clause does not PFIC. Yeah. So I think that's what we. A great question, Melvin. Yeah.
Well, not according to Treasury. Okay,
Okay.
for the reasons that I've given.
Okay. Right. Treasury wouldn't see it that way, but it definitely is discriminatory. But it
Oh, the
doesn't.
whole U.S.
I mean, the
tax.
whole thing is right. The whole thing is
Really?
discriminatory, but they find, they're interpreting. They've exonerated themselves. They cleared themselves of any discrimination. It's amazing.
The U.S. never violates treaties, never does anything wrong.
No,
Okay,
right.
if the U.S. does it, it's presumptively just, equitable, and should be the world standard, unless
It's
it infringes on U.S.
it's
interests.
it's the American way, and we're truly exceptional. We're just simply better than everybody else, and that's why we really should impose our will worldwide. And the biggest victims should be our own citizens because we own them, and
Absolutely, absolutely.
we
But
will.
Anthony,
Yeah.
I think it's important to remember the main message here. The main message of the day: good Americans should not be subject to a Canadian tax. Remember that, Anthony.
That's right. All right. Well, I'm going to ask another good American, Keith Redmond, for his concluding thoughts and what action people should take if they're kind of trying to figure out what they should do. Keith, what are your final thoughts?
Oh boy, what are my final thoughts? I don't know. I think, well, obvious. My go-to is for Americans overseas to maybe educate
Yep.
Mr. Higgins a little bit further
Yeah.
and contact his office
There you go.
and to explain to him why focusing just on Canada is not acceptable, and that he needs to be aware of a greater problem of what the U.S. is doing around the world along
Agreed.
the same lines. And that's what needs to be done.
I think that's
consistent hammering away.
right. And he's opening the door to talk about, he's talking about Representative Higgins opened that door to talk about, international taxation. Okay, it's open. Let's talk about the real issues then. Let's talk about them. So great advice, Keith. I think that's hey, this is the time to reach out to Representative Higgins. Hey, you want to talk about it? Now, anyone who is considering, and this is a valuable service that Keith provides. If you are considering, many people are considering they're not in the U.S. system, but they may need to do a streamlined disclosure, something that we help people out with. But oftentimes, I like when Keith is able to talk to people first to make sure that they are it's the right move for them. So Keith's email, if you want to reach out to him, is US_overseas_advocate@outlook.com. And Keith, what's the name of your Facebook group? People should join if you haven't.
Yeah, American Expatriates for Residency-Based Taxation.
American Expatriates for Residency-Based Taxation. Be sure to join that. And I will also say be sure to subscribe, turn on your notifications, because we're going to be discussing we're going to be doing a live stream of Moore versus US on December 5th, right? Is that the day? That's the day. We're starting at 9:30 a.m., which could have significant impacts. Maybe helpful, maybe not. But it's going to be one of the biggest. It's going to be the biggest tax case ever decided, in my opinion. Which, because the real Constitution of the United States of America is its tax code, therefore it's the biggest case the Supreme Court will actually ever hear. And then I just want to, so thank you very much for joining us today, Keith, and Mr. John Richardson of Citizenship Solutions. Why did I put COM? Isn't that DCA?
All roads lead to me.
All roads lead to John. All right. And so if you're considering renouncing, or if you're considering making a challenge to this, reach out to John at citizenshipsolutions@protonmail.com. And I want to thank both of you guys. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Fantastic topic. And my understanding of the issue is vastly increased. So I want to thank everybody for that. This is Anthony Parent of IRS Medic, and I thank you all for joining us today.